Welcome back to Morsels and Motors, and this exciting episode we're going to do a battle of the decades, a Supermini Battle 1980 versus 1990. Who will win? Who knows? In the blue corner we have battling for the 1980s is this, my Austin Metro. The Metro was launched in October 1980, and at its launch it was widely regarded by a lot of the motoring press at the time as being one of the best superminis or small cars on the market. Things changed about 3 years later when the Peugeot 205 and the Fiat Uno were launched, but in 1980, end of 80, 81, the Metro was king, could do no wrong. In the red corner, battling it out for the 1990s, is a Mark III Fiesta. This was launched in March of 1989 and was the defining supermini for the early 1990s. Again, motoring press at this car's launch were very positive about it, saying that it was significantly better than the previous model in most ways. In terms of specification levels, both these cars are pretty evenly matched because they're both the base model. So at launch, the Metro base model was called the Standard, or just the Metro, which is what this is, although this is a 1983 example. And the Fiesta's base model was the Popular, which is exactly what this is. The main obvious difference between these two cars, as you look at them front on, is how much bigger the Fiesta is than the Metro. The Fiesta is taller, it's wider, it's longer, and it's just generally much more chunky. So what did base model Supermini motoring get you in 1980? Well, it got you a front-wheel drive transversely mounted 1 litre engine with a 4-speed gearbox, a traditional distributor with points and a condenser, no brake servo assistance, although there is on this car because it's been added, and of course a carburettor to feed the fuel into the engine. In 1990, things aren't entirely that different, to be honest. We still have a front-wheel drive 1 litre engine with a 4-speed manual gearbox. We still have a carburettor feeding the fuel into the engine. We have, however, upgraded to a brake servo as standard on even the base model, and there's also electronic ignition control with a non-mechanical distributor system. Both engines are water-cooled with electric cooling fans, and both cars have manual non-power assisted steering. And both cars, in fact, continue to use ancient power units originally introduced in the late 1950s or early 1960s, both in modified form, but ultimately tracing their origins back quite some distance. Although the story is broadly the same under the bonnet, I don't think the same is true of the exterior styling. These cars are very much of their time. The Metro is boxy and angular, the Fiesta is rounded and sleeker. So we've upgraded, for example, on the Metro from a very straight black steel bumper to, on the Fiesta, a much more moulded, rounded plastic affair. You can also really tell on the Fiesta that the bumper doesn't really stick out much compared to the Metro, where it's an entirely separate piece sticking out of the front. So the front end of the Fiesta is significantly more streamlined. We also have wraparound indicators on the Fiesta, whereas the Metro's ones are very much forward-facing only. We're also still on very small, skinny narrow tyres, small wheels and steel wheels with a centre black hubcap, so that's very similar. The Metro's rain gutters really make it look old-fashioned compared to the Fiesta's streamlined drip channels that are integrated into the body shell. From the back you can also really see the very angular lines of the Metro, with these very square tail lights and the square mud flaps and pretty squarish bumper as well. The Fiesta, on the other hand, is a much more rounded affair. It's got a much more shapely tailgate, it's got curves all over the rear light clusters, and obviously there's that bumper that's nice and curved and wraps around. But as a side note, we're still not fully into the 1990s here, so we still have quite a few straight lines, especially around the rear side window. The interior of the Metro is very sweet, but it's very old-fashioned. We have this tiny rimmed, huge steering wheel with its strange bus-like driving position, so it's very difficult when you're sitting properly in the seat to even reach the top of the steering wheel. We've got some lovely body-coloured metal on show even on the front doors. We have a dashboard that doesn't really encroach very far into the cabin at all. In fact, it's almost as if it goes away from the cabin into the engine bay. So we've got loads of storage areas on it, but it's not particularly moulded in any way. It's very simple. We've got some very clunky big switches over here on the right to the steering wheel. Two diddly little column stalks which are very pleasant to use, I have to say. A nice big clear instrument cluster with very few warning lights or information on it. So the cabin itself feels actually really quite spacious, but that's the trick of the Metro. It's a tiny car, but it's somehow bigger inside. It doesn't really make any sense. Medium wave, long wave radio. The seats themselves, they're perfectly supportive, they're very comfortable, but there are no standard headrests on the base model Metro. One of the other major differences between the Metro and the Fiesta is that in the 1980s we had some colour, or at least in the early 80s. So this car is trimmed in a beautiful blue coloured fabric, and we even have matching blue door cards and a blue dashboard. So it's really nice and coordinated in here. It feels a really, really lovely place to be, a really sweet place to be. Rear passenger room in the Metro is pretty decent, considering how tiny the car is, but that's because it's quite cleverly designed. It makes you sit much more upright than other cars. No seat belts, of course, because it's the early 80s and it was not yet a legal requirement. The interior of the Fiesta is an altogether more austere affair, I feel. We're predominantly here with grey as the overall colour. So we've got grey vinyl door cards, although now they do cover the entirety of the door, so there's no body colour metal on show. We have a grey moulded one-piece large dashboard with loads of little cubby holes that extends into the cabin quite far from the windscreen. We've got an instrument cluster that is broadly similar to the Metro in reality. Indicator and wiper stalks broadly the same as the Metro. The radio is a much more modern affair by 1989, 1990. We've got a cassette, we've got FM, the luxury, and we've got a digital display, which means that you can select a station and it kind of stays there. Whereas with the knobs in 1980, it really does like to wander quite a bit. We've also got two speakers here instead of the one single central speaker in the Metro. So tunage in this car is much improved. The seats in this car are probably as comfortable as the Metro seats. They're quite nice and supportive, but you do get integrated headrests by 1990 on both front seats. Rear passenger space in the Fiesta is a little more generous than the Metro, and again the back of the seat is just a little bit less sharp, which means that it's a more comfortable place to sit for a longer amount of time. And of course we do have seat belts because they were a legal requirement by 1990. Accessing the boot in both cars requires the turn of the key. So there is a risk of locking your keys in the car in both cars. The Metro's boot is not too bad for a car that's this tiny. We have a very, very basic vinyl carpet and a one-piece seat that will fold down. We do have a parcel shelf. The boot on the Fiesta is certainly bigger than the one in the Metro, and we have a slightly more carpeted area, but the sides are naked or in paint. We have no parcel shelf to speak of because the Popular just doesn't have one. So what are these two cars like to drive compared to each other? Well, the Metro is a lovely car to drive. It's very sweet. It's quite quick and responsive when you put your foot down on the accelerator, definitely. The experience of driving it does feel very old. The bus-like steering and the tiny thin-rimmed steering wheel really makes you feel like you're driving an ancient car. The gear change on the Metro, A-series Metro in particular, is a little strange because it's quite clunky, and there's no springing action around neutral pushing you into third. When you're going from second to third, I would expect there to be a push, and there isn't. So you have to kind of swing your hand across manually and make sure you're at the right level to get it into third. The change itself, it's just hard work. You know, you've got to push it quite far. There's quite a lot of resistance as you put it into the gears. It's hard. The clutch pedal's also quite heavy. The steering is actually surprisingly light, but that's because it's a big steering wheel. tiny thin little tyres, tiny little wheels. So all in all, I find this car it's a delight to drive, but as soon as you step into any other car, you realise how heavy this is and how difficult in some respects it is to drive. In terms of driving, this car feels much more modern than the Metro. The gear change to start with is beautiful. It is super slick and smooth, and it has a shorter travel. We've got a spring action helping us from second into third, and it's just really confident and snickety. It's lovely and really light. So it just glides into the gears with sort of one finger, whereas the Metro you kind of have to hammer it in, if you like. The pedals in here are much lighter as well, much lighter accelerator, nice light touch on the brakes, and the clutch is also super light. So in terms of driving, it's a much more pleasant, less hard work experience. You don't have to think about it so much. The big difference I feel in the driving position of the two cars is that, first of all, the steering wheel here is at a much more normal angle, so it's pointing towards you rather than kind of away from you. And also, you're sitting somehow lower in the car and slightly further back, so you're just taking up slightly more lateral space in the car. The Metro kind of makes you sit right upright, that's taking up as little teeny weeny space as humanly possible, whereas this one you can sort of sit back and relax a little bit more. There's just a little bit more space. The steering effort, however, is bigger in this car because it's a slightly smaller steering wheel, slightly bigger wheels, but the big reason is that the ratio is different. So from lock to lock on this one requires significantly more turns of the wheel than in the Metro. The suspension setup of the two cars is also really very different. So obviously the Metro has a hydrogas system, which is quite different to the spring system in the Fiesta. The car feels really planted and secure. It feels like a modern car is to drive. So what, dear viewer, is my conclusion on this fine pair? Who wins, 1980, 1990? Well, let's be a little bit fair about this here. I think they both win. If this actually was 1990 and we were trying to pick a car to actually own at the time and drive, I'd go for the Fiesta because it's significantly more refined, easier to drive than the Metro. The Metro feels like it's from a bygone era in comparison. So absolutely, in 1990, that would win because it would be a daily use, daily driving car. But in 2021, I'm looking at this with the eyes of a retro car enthusiast or a classic car enthusiast. Which would I choose in that respect? I think they both have their merits. The Metro is sweet and has a beautiful little interior and is an iconic British shape. The Fiesta is more modern, it's easier to drive, it feels more robust, but it lacks some character and charm. So for me, because they're a classic car choice, not an ordinary driving car choice, I would pick the Metro every day of the week. Well, thank you for joining me for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I wonder what you make of my conclusion. Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you again in another video very soon.